The Afrikaner people, or the Boers as we are generally known in much of the world, have had our fair share of triumphs and troubles over the last few centuries. We are a small nation, and it is the fate of small nations to be constantly concerned about their own survival. Big nations often take survival for granted, and often at their own peril. The Afrikaner people have had many great achievements over the last few centuries. And one of the achievements that we are most proud of is the treasure chest of Afrikaans literature, produced by a long list of remarkable thinkers and authors. And one of these great thinkers was the poet, playwright and philosopher NP van Wyk Louw. Louw remains a legendary figure in Afrikaner culture, having played a significant role in shaping Afrikaner thought and describing Afrikaner tradition, especially in response to global politics and Enlightenment ideology. Yet he remains relatively unknown to others. This is largely due to the fact that his work was primarily written in Afrikaans and translations are scarce. One of his remarkable works is a series of essays published in 1958 under the title Liberal Nationalism, a title that sits uncomfortably with most readers, and for good reason. This is because those who regard themselves as liberal tend to regard nationalism as the problem, while those who regard themselves as nationalists tend to regard liberalism as the problem. Louw, however, makes some striking observations about the similarities and differences between these two concepts before he argues for a frame of reference that one might describe as liberal nationalism. Now, from the get-go, it's worth noting that there is a difference between national liberalism and liberal nationalism. Louw's argument is not for liberalism as the solution, but for a recognition of the rights and aspirations of peoples and nations. However, in these essays, he argues for the latter, but from a liberal perspective. Much like Roger Scruton's description of conservatism as something that is pursued in the name of love, Louw claims that we are first and foremost driven by love of our nations. And now when Louw says nations, it's worth noting that he does not mean the modern nation state as we know it today, but the collection of people that form an overarching cultural community. He then explains that the way in which a person loves his people is not the same as the love between a husband and wife, but more akin to the way a parent loves his child. With this, he means that this type of love is not first and foremost directed at strength or beauty, but at weakness, blindness, vulnerability, and a mere possibility. For this reason, Louw concludes, we love a people not for its achievements, but for its hardships. The love for a child metaphor is by no means a way of saying that the individual is bigger than the nation, but rather that the individual has responsibility to the nation, and that love of the nation is rooted in a recognition of its vulnerability. Liberalism, he goes on to say, claims that a person must figure out his own way through life and fix his own problems. Now, surely we can argue that this is not an apt description of liberalism anymore, but remember that Louw was writing in a particular time and context. However, man is by nature also selfish and capable of committing evil, which is why classical liberalism argues that your freedom to do as you please does not include the freedom to hurt others. In this sense, he references Evelyn Beatrice Hall's famous words in The Friends of Voltaire that, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." This is what liberalism is all about, or at least what it was supposed to be all about. And so against this backdrop, Louw concludes, isn't it the basic thought here that I believe that you think wrongly, I will reason with you to convince you of the wrongness, but you will have to see it for yourself. And if someone wants to force you from the outside and with violence to speak otherwise, then he touches the deepest part of you and me. Our spiritual growth must be determined by our own insights. The point then is that the principle so aptly captured by Hall is and should be equally applicable to nations. And so in Louw's words, this can be summarized as follows. I think that my people, or another, believe wrong things, but I will oppose to the utmost that they be forced to change by violence and from without. I will reason with people and try to convince them, but a change must be effected by their own better insights. And so for this reason, Louw concludes that if it is indeed true that nationalism constitutes narrow thinking, then the same criticism should be applicable to liberalism. It is not, however, narrow thinking to love what you have and to be grateful for it. In fact, self-love is perfectly natural, whereas it is wholly unnatural to love yourself and your people. This is the great commandment after all. Love God and love your neighbor as you love yourself. In this sense, Louw remarks that the great commandment does not call on us to love our neighbors more than we love ourselves, the very thing that much of the Western world is increasingly demanding. Respect for tradition is a recurring theme in Louw's work. In this sense, Louw lists 3 modes in which we can live with regard to tradition. The first is to live in tradition. By this he means that we become wholly captured by our tradition to such an extent that we are unable to interact or engage with the modern world. Historical answers become the be-all and end-all of our frame of reference. The other extreme is to live outside of tradition. By this, he refers to modern ideologies that seek to detach the individual from everything that he has inherited, as if no one before us has given thought to anything. The third, he says, is to live from tradition. Living from tradition implies a way of life in which we constantly learn from the past and in which we are continuously in conversation with those who came before us. We are grateful for what we have inherited, and we recognize that tradition is a set of solutions to which we have forgotten the problems, to reference Donald Kingsbury. Yet, we live in a modern world in which we have to consult tradition without losing our senses. And so, needless to say, Louw argues that the latter, to live from tradition, is the only responsible choice of the 3 modes of thinking. In our modern day and age, it is easy to emphasize the importance of individual freedom and neglect the freedom of the community, precisely because the notion of freedom of the community has become so interwoven with our traditional frame of reference that it is easy to take it for granted. Louw compares the right of communities to arrange their affairs as they see fit with the air that we breathe. When we breathe, we don't think about breathing. It comes naturally, and it is simply part of who we are and how we do things. It is only when our air is cut off that suddenly we cannot think of anything else. And like the air he breathes, so the individual within a great national community enjoys his natural rights. The underlying point is that individual freedom can only really be sustainably recognized if the underlying conditions are met. Freedom for the community or the nation provides the context within which the individual can become free to make his own decisions. History, and the 20th century in particular, has had its fair share of tyrants who attempted to pursue the good of the community at the expense of all other goods. Likewise, pursuing the good that is individual freedom at the expense of every other good leads to conflict and violence. And so once we detach freedom for the individual from freedom for the community, we set ourselves up for a conflict that can only be laid to rest by recognizing that the individual can never be free if the community is not free, and that the community can never be free if the citizens that make up that community are not free to live their lives according to their own unique norms and customs. This necessarily means that the route to freedom lies through responsibility, reciprocity, and in some cases even sacrifice, not as a result of force, but as a result of love. And so attempting to dissolve this coherence, to detach freedom from responsibility and communal identity, is just as futile as attempting to achieve mutual recognition and respect by beating the other into submission.